Two friends were walking down the sidewalk on a busy street during rush hour. There was all sorts of noise in the city: cars, honking horns, feet shuffling, people talking noisily. And amid all the noise, one of the friends turned to the other and said, "I hear a cricket." "No way," her friend responded. "How could you hear a cricket with all of this noise? You must be imagining it. Besides, I've never seen a cricket in New York City." "No, really, I do. I hear a cricket. I'll show you." She stopped for a moment and then led her friend across the street to a big cement planter with a tree in it. And pushing back the leaves, she found a little brown cricket. "That's amazing," said her friend. "You must have superhuman hearing. What's your secret?" "No, my hearing's just the same as yours," she said. "There's no secret," the first woman replied. "Watch, I'll show you." And with that, she reached into her pocket. She pulled out some loose change and threw it on the sidewalk. Amid all of the noise in the city, everyone within 30 feet turned their head to see where the sound of the money was coming from. "See," she said, "it's all a matter of what you are listening for." Last week, as part of my study leave, I attended a 5-day silent retreat focusing on spiritual practice. It was led by Unitarian Universalist ministers, and participants were a mix of ministers and of lay people. What better way than to do in-depth study of this month's theme of renewal, right? So as we began our silent retreat, the facilitators asked us what we were listening for. What voices were paramount in our heads as we arrived? Voices we perhaps wanted to let go of as we entered into this time of silence. So we all wrote things on sticky notes and put them on a board. People wrote such responses as the demands and needs of others, the sound of the TV news, the latest government antics, negative self-talk, shoulds, worry, and work. They were sounds and voices we'd given a lot of attention to in the day-to-day world before coming to this retreat. They then invited us to reflect on what voices we might wish to listen to over the next 5 days during our time of silence. And we all journaled about this individually. Meanwhile, the leaders asked us during our silent time to notice how much energy it takes to speak to people and to engage with them. Watch yourself sometimes and see that. We choose our words, we contemplate how they land, and then we listen to the other person and try and interpret what they mean. Did we get it right or wrong, or did they understand us? After our interactions, the words often go through our minds and we wonder, were they the right words? Did they understand me? Did they misinterpret what I said? And so forth. So to be free of the pressure to speak and to listen for a week was liberating. And this was highlighted by the fact that there was another group at our retreat center who were talking vociferously about peace literacy all week. Ironic that their focus was on peace. It was interesting to hear and observe their conversations and notice how many wasted words there were, and how much we say just to help us feel comfortable with one another. I felt a little bit like a fish in a fishbowl, watching all the goings-on around me as I swam in the waters of silence. We wore big name badges that said, "I am on silent retreat," so that this other group would refrain from talking to us during shared meal times and in the cafeteria line. For this silent retreat, I chose to do a complete media fast. No internet, no news, no texting, no email. We had an emergency contact number for our family, so I trusted that I would hear if there was something urgent. And it was so hard not to look and see what the latest awful thing that was happening in the world was. But I did it. I only used my computer for writing down reflections and ideas. And the only time we broke our silence was for our daily half hour of spiritual direction, during which we could speak to our facilitators about the dreams we were having or the thoughts that were coming up for us in silence. And believe me, there are a lot of thoughts in the midst of silence. You can hear them very loudly. We also had several daily sessions on spiritual practices, from labyrinth walking to art journaling to meditating, praying, to something called interplay, and even shamanism. During those sessions, we could ask questions if we wished, but meals were in silence, and the rest of the day was in silence. It was marvelous to have so much quiet time. I read a book a day. I hiked and walked the labyrinth. I worked with my dreams and listened to my internal voices. I meditated, journaled, and envisioned ideas for CVUUF. I had the space to be creative and think deeply without the day-to-day distractions and demands of email, phone calls, Facebook, the internet, work, and family. It's amazing how much time there is without all of that. In silence, I realized we gain our true education and our deeper wisdom. One of my favorite theologians, Howard Thurman, said, "In the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whisper of the heart, giving strength to weakness, courage to fear, and hope to despair." In fact, I was soon required to draw on my inner voices of courage. On the first day, as I was sitting in the spiritual practices class, something landed on my head. And I didn't know what it was and tried to move it, but in the process, it stung me. As it fell to the floor, I saw it was a large bee, and it had stung me on my forehead, right above my third eye. Immediately, my head started throbbing. I haven't been stung by a bee in as long as I can remember, so I didn't know if I was going to be allergic to it. I went to the bathroom and found the stinger and a spot of blood where I'd been stung. And meanwhile, the pain continued to grow. The difficulty with being in silence when you're stung by a bee and are hurting is that I couldn't tell people what had happened to me. I had to quietly bear the pain by myself and couldn't seek comfort or sympathy. It reminded me that normally in such situations of discomfort, I like to find people who'll be sympathetic and help allay my fears. But I quickly realized that this would be another one of those opportunities when I would learn to turn inward for courage and strength. You know those kinds of opportunities. I thought about the spiritual practices being taught, encouraging us to focus on observing what was happening, accepting it, without trying to change it or get out of it. In fact, they were encouraging us to welcome in the discomfort rather than push it away. Okay, so as my head continued to throb all afternoon and the swelling on my forehead grew, I took it as my first lesson for courage for the week, to welcome in the hurt and this bee sting. I was surprised that I was stronger and more resilient in my isolation than I imagined I would be. Eventually, the pain subsided, and I was left with an attractive bump on my forehead, and a good reminder for the week that I'd be able to surmount difficult thoughts and painful experiences going forward. As the Christian theologian Henry Nouwen says, solitude is the furnace for transformation. And I was definitely deep in the furnace of transformation throughout the whole week. In fact, throughout that day and the next, there were incessant flies buzzing around my head. And now, feeling more nervous of insects flying around my head, I noticed being more reactive to the bother of the buzzing and worried that there was going to be another bee. But because of the silence, I had the chance to reflect on the metaphor of the flies. They reminded me of the interminable buzzing of my mind. As soon as there was silence, I would hear all kinds of thoughts buzzing around my head, often bothering my peace. Does anyone else have a lot of thoughts in the midst of quiet? Thank you, Susan. You and I. So I began to accept and stop resisting both the buzzing insects in my interminable mind chatter. And as I did, they seemed to diminish and leave me alone. Through that, I learned another powerful lesson. Noticing and accepting what is, even welcoming it in, whether it's the loud sound of a chainsaw in the midst of a meditation or the relentless buzzing insects. When I stopped resisting these stimuli, their impact on me seemed to lessen. I was able to find greater peace within the midst of annoyance and disturbance. Over time, I noticed that whether there is silence or not, the mind will think. And often that thinking can go down negative pathways such as fear, worry, or judgment. It's just the human condition. But I realized in the silence that it could be our choice whether to allow negative thinking or rather find a more life-enhancing alternative. After all, we redirect children from destructive behaviors to more positive ones, right? We stop 2-year-olds from walking towards a plug and putting their hand in a socket, for example. So with great intention, I noticed I could actually redirect my own negative or stress-thinking thoughts towards those which nurture me more. So perhaps we just need to give our minds the kind of attention and discipline that we give to 2-year-olds. Offer them that kind of redirection. I certainly find it useful for my mind. And I actually wonder whether negative thinking, such as complaints, worry, fear, and stress, could often just be idleness of the mind, or the easier, familiar, known groove for our brains to go down. It's an established pattern of reaction rather than a conscious, positive choice. So my friends, I wondered, what if we offer a playground of other choices and possibilities within which the mind could be tempted to play safely and happily? One of the spiritual practices we were introduced to was making art. Now, my negative internal voices started having a field day. I can't do art. I'm not creative in that way. My art looks like a young child's art. I'm really no good at it. But there were so many tools and possibilities available, from stencils to stickers to spray paint, from crayons, chalks, and pastels to watercolors and more, that I had room to play and explore. I had the opportunity to let my adult inner critic be tantalized by a playground of possibilities. And that was liberating. In fact, I started to remember how much I love making art, whether I'm good at it or not. I found it engaging and expressive and a wonderful tool for calming the mind and for centering myself. In fact, when I came home, I immediately set up an art station at my dining room table with colored pencils and pastels, and I found that my teenager and I loved sitting next to each other, doodling and chatting. And he had that same negative voice, I can't do art, and suddenly we're both drawing together and having fun. Excuse me a moment. There were so many realizations throughout this week, too numerous to share here right now. But one of the gifts that I came away with was that all the emotions and states of being that come up for me in ordinary, everyday life all happened during the retreat too, away from all my normal stimuli. The external environment and others didn't seem to be my only stimuli. From anxiety to peace, from sorrow to joy, from sleepless nights to deep restful sleep, they all showed up during this week. They all showed up despite the fact that I was on a 5-day news fast, so had no input from what often stresses me. They showed up despite the fact that I was away from my family, so had none of the usual chores and responsibilities of home life. And they showed up despite the fact that I didn't need to talk to anyone or get anything particular done. And yet still, this mind and body that is me had all kinds of feelings and internal reactions. Thanks to the silence and the lack of stimuli, I was able to watch them and realize they actually have very little to do with my environment. Oh, sure, external circumstances can heighten them, but they occur naturally and normally with few stimuli as well. So I realized that much of who we are seems to be just a part of our DNA, part of our genetic makeup, part of our particular hormonal, physical, and emotional constitution. But what was different from daily life was that I could listen for and find strategies to help notice and address this, and not just react. So when negative or stressful thinking arose, I found a palette of tools to help me dissipate or move quickly through the feeling states. Tools such as going for a gratitude run, or engaging in art that expressed what I was feeling, or walking in nature, or writing down my thoughts in a journal, or praying, or meditating, or even softly playing my harp. Reading something engaging and uplifting also helped, as did consciously choosing to focus on nature or even dancing and moving my body. Now I realize I'm sharing a lot of personal information here, but it's really with the hope that we all might find more compassion and understanding for our monkey minds and our habitual reactions. And I invite you to think about what helps you reset or calm your mind. Ultimately, this time of silence provided a beautiful mirror for the human condition. It's all there, the beauty and messiness of life in a 5-day living experiment. When all the external conditions were as near to perfect as they could be, heaven on earth, essentially. Life within still went on in all its variety and intensity. So just as we offer understanding and compassion to young children when they're having a tough time, I wonder if we could welcome and not shun the parts of ourselves that struggle. Acknowledging the shadow, even loving it as part of who I am, helped me find greater ease with it. It taught me greater acceptance, understanding, and compassion for all of us amidst our many life challenges. It's clearer to me now why most religious traditions have silent time as part of their essential spiritual practices. The core of Buddhist practice is mindfulness meditation, as many of you know. Christians have been engaging in the practice of centering prayer for centuries. Islam and Judaism too recommend time in silent retreat, contemplating the nature of God and existence. Indeed, Muhammad was said to have received the first parts of the Quran during an isolated retreat in the mountains. And Moses received the 10 Commandments alone, atop a mountain. In fact, learning how to be in silence and inner reflection is something I feel would also profoundly transform the practice of Unitarian Universalism. We're good at going out and being active and speaking, but I feel we could learn to have more time in silence and reflection. It gave me a deeper commitment to engaging regular periods of silence as well as diverse spiritual practices. I want to keep listening, as the boy did in the story, for the wisdom voices which so want to emerge from within, only given the space. And I invite you to do the same as you practice our faith. So another thing that emerged from contemplation during the retreat is that I would like to teach a class here on spiritual practices for challenging times, beginning later this fall. And I hope you'll join me for that and watch for more information on that class. And since it feels vital to my work as a minister, I plan to make this retreat an annual tradition and find times throughout the year during my study leave to have days of silence. And if any of you feel called to join me on this retreat next year, please ask me for more information or pick up one of these flyers that my colleagues sent me, and they're out in the foyer. They already have dates for next year in August, and so feel free to pick one of these up. It would be wonderful if any of you wanted to join us there. It takes place at La Casa de Maria in Santa Barbara, which is a beautiful spot. In closing, as we ended our retreat, the facilitators asked us what voices we were listening for now. Most everyone there had been deeply transformed by this experience. We were now listening for the voices of inner wisdom and guidance, for compassion, for peace, for joy, for the whisper of the divine, and for kindness and patience, among many others. We had been restored to listening to our true selves rather than the clamor of the world. As our esteemed Unitarian forefather, Ralph Waldo Emerson, said, "Within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, the eternal one." May we all make time and space to listen to that voice within. May it be so. Amen.